Looks like we are live. All right, so right back into it. Part 4, everybody. The 1920s. Let's go. We're talking about gender change. We're going to wrap up culture change here now. It's been referred to as sex o'clock in America. So let's dive right in and talk about changing roles of women. Of course, this is referring to the urban city areas. The flappers, this sense of devil-may-care independence, women flaunting the social norms, having fun, smoking cigarettes, wearing scandalous clothes for the times, just a new sense of independence and liberation on a fun sense, not necessarily on a social sense in terms of the workplace or other kinds of dynamics. It's also 1920 is the era of Sigmund Freud and his whole psychoanalysis and approach to sexual liberation. Margaret Sanger is an important name for the 1920s. She was central in the role to fight for women's access to birth control and considered to be one of the founders of Planned Parenthood. Here she was forbidden to speak about birth control, and so she had her assistant put on a gag, and she proceeded to write on the board to a group of college students explaining different options for birth control. She's been accused by some of having been involved in some kind of a eugenics scheme, birth control, in order to not have certain people procreate, but there's a whole debate on whether or not she was really a part of that. You can look into that on your own time, but know that she was famous for birth control and Planned Parenthood. The other really famous female names to know are Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. These are the two women who really fought for that 1920s suffrage campaign. A lot of women were involved in the right for women to vote, but of course these two were the central organizers. You can see Lucy on the right there in her prison cell. These women were arrested. They spent time behind bars. They organized hunger strikes in prison. There was picketing at the White House. They received horrible treatment. There's actually a whole very nasty story behind the suffering of these women that they went through in order to gain the right to vote that we've all but forgotten. It barely makes it into our textbooks. Great movie, Iron-Jawed Angels, HBO special. If there's time at the very end, I'll show you guys a clip or two from that just to check out. But let's move right on and talk about after getting the right to vote in 1920, these women continued to struggle and push for an amendment, an equal rights amendment. And that was as early as 1923. It'll go to Congress in 1972. They will continue for another 50 years to struggle for it, and sadly, or well, it depends on your perspective, I suppose, but in 72, it'll be approved by 38 states, by 35 states when it only needed 38 to pass, and so it does not pass, and we still don't have an equal rights amendment in this country for women, for women's rights. Women's jobs will not make any major changes in the 20s. We'll see that women become involved in the cities in clerk-type jobs, office work, and as telephone operators. But other than that, the women's realm sees very little change in the workforce. One final change worth mentioning is in the educational systems of the 1920s. John Dewey is the man of the 20s. He's the learning by doing guy. We love him at CSS. Progressive education, wants to get students more active. The results of a lot of shifting on the John Dewey system is a doubling in the number of high school graduates. We're now getting to more and more Americans finishing high school. We can move on now to conflict and crises. And we're going to start by talking about the urban versus rural conflict. I already mentioned the 1920 census brought us to the 51% urban. Remember at the Civil War, we were only 20% living in cities. So we've had this rapid increase. City populations are growing and growing and growing. Today, it's about 16% of America is rural, so we've gone completely the other direction. Anyways, we're going to go right into talking about nativism and the resurgence of the KKK. This starts in 1915. The KKK comes back with a vengeance. You'll notice on the right, yes, that's what you see. They are marching on the nation's capital, and they don't even need to cover their faces. They're proud of who they are and what they do in this time period. They were anti-Jew, they were anti-Eastern European, they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-radical, anti-communist, anti-union, anti-black, anti-birth control, anti-intellectual, and anti-women's rights. they were pretty much equal opportunity haters. They hated everybody, and they grew to 5 million members. Sad to report they were strong here in Colorado. Happy to report that by the end of the 20s, they hurt themselves with a lot of scandals, including the embezzlement of initiation fees and sex scandals among their leadership. They lost a lot of their mainstream appeal, but these are pictures from the 1925 march, 40,000 strong on our nation's capital. Oh, the shame, right? Anyways, Sacco and Vanzetti is a famous case from the 1920s. These two Italian anarchists were arrested in 1921, convicted of a murder of which they claimed to be innocent. They were executed 6 years later in 1927, despite what some have called weak evidence and a major international protest. It was believed by many that they were killed more for their ideas and their ethnicity than their political views. Although other historians will refer to damning evidence. It's been left out there as one of those sort of remaining scandals and remaining mysteries as to whether or not they were involved. Here's a London protest, save Sacco and Vanzetti. Here's a political cartoon from the 1920s. You have the Statue of Liberty, and you have your European anarchist with his knife and his bomb. Come unto me, ye oppressed. We're opening our doors to these dangerous, shady characters from Europe who are going to blow up our country. The 100%ers, 100% Americans, this was a group that worked hard to limit immigration and also to limit foreign cultural, political influences. They were isolationists in the true sense of the term. It was a political organization, and they were quite successful. And we're going to see some major immigration changes in this time period. A great cartoon that was called The Only Way to Handle It. And you see the teeming masses from Europe trying to come to America, and then all of a sudden Uncle Sam putting in his little 3% gate. We have, I'll let you just read that. Dramatic shifts in where people are coming from. So what you'll notice in this chart is how Northwestern Europeans are getting to be a smaller and smaller piece of the pie as we move to 1901 to 1910. They're just a tiny fraction. And then a dramatic reversal in the 20s and 30s. And that's not because there were more and more people coming from Northwestern Europe. It's because we shut off access to Southeastern Europeans through certain regulations, right? And we'll talk about those. I'm going to see. We don't want that right now. Looking at this chart, it gives us a couple of our different laws. So I'm going to go through these now real quick. 1917, the Literacy Test Act was passed. President Wilson vetoed this thing, but it required you to have or be able to pass a literacy test in English or in a few other certain native tongues like French and German and Spanish. Not every language was covered, but many of them were. Then you have the emergency quota of 1921. All right, and this was really had a goal of reducing Southern and Eastern European immigration. We wanted fewer Italians. They were sort of the new Irish, right? We wanted fewer people, especially of Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Eastern Europe was this huge fear of radicalism. And basically, it set a rule in 1921 that 5% of the immigrants from that country who came in 1910 could now enter. All right, it's important to understand this. So 5% of those who came in 1910. So you take this number from 1910, who came that year, and then 5% of that number was now allowed. And then the official long-lasting act was the Immigration Act quota of 1924. And you can see what that does. Look at the yellow there with the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Look how high they were on the top, and then look at the trickle that they're going to fall to. The Immigration Act of 24 is basically going to state, and it's known as the National Origins Plan. It's 2% of those who came in 1890 are now allowed in. All right, and when you go all the way back to 1890, you go back to a time when there were more people from Western Europe coming still to America. There weren't any Japanese coming hardly, and so now this means that almost none can come in. This will essentially be the law until the 1960s. There's two more quotas, 1929 and 1952, but you'll notice those barely make any change. Right? So the really dramatic one to know is the Immigration Act of 1924. And immigration, as you see, goes down to a trickle and really changes quite dramatically what's going on. This is a multiple choice question. I'm just going to throw it out there. It's about cultural change and this idea of cultural pluralism. I'll just let you look it over real quick. It is a useful question. It comes right out of an AP exam. If you're here to study for the AP exam, then this is the one that you want to look at. All right, moving right along. Antievolution, Science versus Religion, the famous Scopes monkey trial, and the teaching of evolution, Hell and the High School. So this is obviously the anti-evolution. They did not want it to be allowed. Long story short, we have this famous trial where the teacher in, I believe that was the Scopes fellow, I believe it was Tennessee, if I remember correctly, was teaching evolution, and he's arrested. And he will actually, most people don't remember this part of the story, he will lose the case and be fined $100. Clarence Darrow, hotshot lawyer, was his defense. William Jennings Bryan, former Secretary of State, ran for president 4 times. He will be the highly religious supporter of the anti-evolution group. He'll be ridiculized. He'll die a few years after this trial, actually. Very dramatic, very interesting case. Doesn't, of course, end the issue. As we know, it's still a hot topic in a lot of parts of America today. And then finally, the Red Scare. Let's just mention briefly the Red Scare. Starts in 1919 with the Seattle General Strike, known as the Anarchy of Russia. And then you have Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. And this guy had bombs going off outside his house. There were bombs on Wall Street in 1920, which leads to just sort of a mass panic, giving him all kinds of powers to deport, attack unions, anybody who's considered a socialist, immigrants in general, massive clampdown. On top of that, in 1920, we had this thing called the Criminal Syndicalism Law, which made it a crime basically to do certain things in unions. Obviously an attack on the First Amendment, but they got away with it. And also dramatically in this 1920 election, you don't see it here in this map, of course, which we already saw, but you had 5 New York congressmen who were elected. They were socialists, but they were refused their seats. Men who were democratically elected refused to be allowed into Congress because of their political leanings. Whether you agree with socialism or not, it seems like an odd thing to do with the United States tradition. Anyways, we also mentioned in this time period closed versus open shop, this huge debate about whether or not, well, a closed shop means you have to be in the union. An open shop means that people who work there don't have to be in the union, and that's what the bosses lean towards. That's what they certainly prefer. Let's get back into presidential politics. We're going to talk briefly here about the decade. It's a decade of Republican administrations. We are retreating from progressivism, retreating from reform. It's known as a pro-business, conservative decade that will change dramatically with the crash of 1929, which will lead to a severe, prolonged depression, devastating the American economy and spirit. But let's talk Harding. He's often been compared to Ulysses S. Grant. He's the president you want to compare him to. President Harding, President Grant, right? They're both post-war presidents, Civil War, now World War I, and they're both men surrounded, they're both popular guys who are surrounded by incredibly corrupt administrations, okay? Now, that said, these guys are not the corrupt ones. Secretary of State Hughes, you've got Mellon at the Treasury, you've got Herbert Hoover, who's important later as Secretary of Commerce, and then you've got former President Taft, who will be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's been referred to as a McKinley-style old order, pro-business, anti-labor. Government is not in the business of helping the common man, it's in the business of helping business, whatever you feel about that. Laissez-faire is the name of the game, right? Stay out of the economy by, of course, helping and favoring certain larger members of the economy. Let's talk about the dismantling of government control over the economy. So the Esch-Cummings Transportation Act of 1920. This led to the reprivatizing of the railroads. It ended a lot of the wartime restrictions, wartime government operations. Many people were hoping for a permanent nationalization of things like the railroad, but after the war, this makes sure that it gets handed back. Merchant Marine Act, again, getting the government out of shipping, 1,500 ships sold back at super low prices. The Railway Labor Board had come out of the wartime boards, but it'll continue to act more in favor of big business and not necessarily seeming to take or even listen to the side of the workers. couple of other important ones. The Veterans Bureau was created in 21. This is a very important one. It's the first time that we have actually hospitals specifically designed for the rehabilitation and health care of our veterans. We have the American Legion, created in 1919, which is another group, sort of a social club for former military. And then very important, because this will come up in the next unit, we have the Adjusted Compensation Act, the bonus, 1924, $3.5 billion, an amount of money that President Coolidge will actually veto, but it's a bonus to soldiers who fought in World War I that they're going to receive, forget it's something like 10 years later. We're going to move into international relations, but we will do that in the final part of this unit. Thank you very much.